Hello class, thank you so much for joining me today. So today's lecture is going to be focused on a paper called The Technology of Skill Formation by James Heckman, which is the second piece of theoretical research we'll be looking at this semester, focused on understanding the way that parents influence their children's later life outcomes, particularly their incomes and education. And this paper is particularly interested in understanding the role that parents play in producing skills for their children, in investing in what we're going to call children's human capital. So before I dive into the paper, I just want to take a moment to talk about where this theory comes from and how it connects to Becker's work that we looked at last time. The first thing to note is that this work was written almost half a century after Becker did his work and is in many ways building on and responding to this canonical work on human capital formation and parental investment in children done by Gary Becker. In particular, what Heckman's going to try to do is plug the holes in Becker's theory that are failing to explain, failing to understand a broad range of empirical research on child development and the effect of interventions in child development that occurred over the course of that past half century. So while Becker was primarily interested in developing a theory that could be applied to any society, anywhere in the world at any time, right? This incredibly grand 1,000 miles up theory of parents' relationships with children, Heckman's goal is to develop a theory that can help explain and tie together a growing piece of empirical research, body of empirical research, aimed at providing specific advice to policymakers about how to help disadvantaged children develop their skills. And so, there's a couple particular questions that he's really interested in. He's interested in questions like, when in the life cycle is it most effective to invest in children? Right? Are we going to have better luck by investing in children when they're very young, or increasing the quality of education when children are older, right? Increasing access to college. He wants to know how we should invest in children, right? How should we measure, how should we determine whether particular types of interventions are high quality? What constitutes good quality preschool or good quality elementary school? And in order to know that, he wants to know what objectives should we be focusing on when we're investing in children. And as a result of that, what should we measure if we want to know whether a particular policy intervention is successful? So, should we be focused on seeing whether preschool improves children's test scores when they're in first grade? Or should we be focused on whether preschool improves children's conscientiousness, ability to come to, or likelihood of coming to class on time or sitting still? Should we look at children's earnings or incarceration or drug use when they're adults? So these are the fundamental questions motivating Heckman's work. And in order to understand this work, I want us to start with a really, really brief overview of the child development literature that's used to motivate this research, and then we'll dive into the model and how that model helps us understand the empirical research. So the first big finding, the first big claim that Heckman makes is that if we look in this sort of very, very big picture sense at the estimated effects, the estimated benefits of different types of schooling investments for disadvantaged children, we tend to see this relationship where investments made at older ages tend to have lower returns on investment. In other words, investments in high quality preschool, the most famous of which are the peri-preschool program and the abecedarian program, tend to have very, very high returns on investment, very, very large long-term effects on things like someone's adult income, likelihood of finishing high school, welfare use, incarceration, etc. Whereas job training programs, right, which occur when people are adults, tend to have very, very low returns on investment. There are positive effects of giving someone access to job training on their income and other life outcomes, but those effects are very small, especially relative to the cost of those programs. So this first fundamental finding that he wants to understand is, what do we make of the fact that earlier life stage programs seem to have better, larger effects than later life stage programs? The other thing he wants to understand is how to make sense of the fact that these early life stage programs, which he's particularly interested in, have quite different effects on what we might think of as cognitive skills, things like measured IQ or scores on standardized tests, than they do on non-cognitive skills. Things like your rating of conscientiousness, your likelihood of arriving to school on time, your teacher's report of your behavioral problems. So what this graph is doing is showing the results of the preschool program, which was a very expensive, ultra high quality preschool program randomly given to disadvantaged children in the 1960s on the recipients' measured IQs at various ages after the program, right? So the children were enrolled in preschool when they were 3 years old. Measured IQs went up dramatically by the time they were 4 and 5 years old, right? Went up from 80 points, right, which is more than a standard deviation below average, to close to average IQ for the total population, right? Average of almost 95 points, and then slowly converged to the average IQ of the control group, right? Children who just through random chance did not receive preschool were identical to the children who did in every other way. So this sort of finding was used for a long time to argue that while preschool programs had good early life effects, those effects tended to fade out. That, you know, we can do a lot for kids to make them prepared for first grade, but by the time children are graduating from high school, we can't tell who went to preschool and who didn't. And, you know, just for a broader sense of this, if we look across a whole range of different preschool programs, we're going to see the same thing, that immediately following an intervention, there tend to be very, very positive effects of preschool and test scores. By, you know, many, many years out after the intervention, those differences in test scores fade to almost nothing. On the other hand, when we look at life outcomes associated with non-cognitive skills, we're going to see very large and lasting effects of getting access to these high quality preschool programs. So here, the blue bars here are showing you essentially a series of outcomes for children who did receive preschool, and beige bars are showing you the same outcomes for identical children who randomly didn't receive preschool. And what you can see is that, you know, by age 40, you're much less likely to have been arrested at your 5 or more times if you'd gone to preschool. You were more likely to have earnings below a very low threshold, right? Earn more than $20,000 a year by the time you're 40. Much more likely to have graduated high school. Much more likely to be finishing your homework on time when you're in high school. And, you know, as we saw before, more likely to have a high measured IQ when you're age 5, even though that difference disappears over time. So whereas the short run effects of preschool and cognitive abilities, you know, measures of cognitive ability seem to disappear, there are these long run effects that operate through non-cognitive pathways. So these findings bring up a series of really important questions we need to answer if we want to know how to direct resources effectively towards disadvantaged children, that we can't get much insight from looking at a model like Becker's model. So for example, is this large gain in cognitive achievement scores for young children given high quality preschool a real gain that simply isn't sustained because of what happens later in those children's life? Or is it an illusion? Is it that giving access to high quality preschool to young children can boost their measured IQs in the short run by teaching them stuff that they were going to learn anyway? Are these non-cognitive skills that children seem to have developed in preschool more important when they're paired with higher levels of cognitive skill or when they're paired with lower levels of cognitive skill? And to what extent should we be developing our entire educational curriculum around those skills rather than around developing people's ability to score high on an achievement test? And if we want to help disadvantaged parents help their children, are we going to be more able to, is it going to be sufficient to do that to give access to things like student loans for college? Or do we need to provide financial assistance and financial resources to families earlier in their child's development? So in order to answer these sorts of questions, we need theory that does a couple things, right? One thing is we need to have theory that takes into account the developmental stages that children go through in life, right? In other words, instead of just having a single period that we call childhood, we want to have a model that allows us to ask, how does what happens to a child in early childhood influence what happens to that child when they're elementary school age, when they're high school age, when they're young adult? We want a model that is going to have a more complex sense of what skills and abilities mean, right? That allow for us to look at multiple skills and the interaction between different types of skill. And lastly, we want a model that has a richer and more modern understanding of the interplay between nature and nurture, right? If we think about the Becker model, The only thing we've got in the Becker model, we've got basically two things that might have to do with ability or nature, right? We have this inherited endowment from the parent that doesn't connect to anything, right? You just get this benefit from the parent. And we have this academic ability or return to human capital parameter, which we call Z, that influences the return on human capital investment. But we don't have any sense of ability or nature being something that can accumulate over time, can be influenced by or activated by characteristics of a child's environment. All of which we're going to need if we're going to want to be able to answer questions about how to direct resources to needy children. Okay, so what we're going to do for the rest of this lecture is I'm going to start by laying out a simplified version of Heckman's model. And this model, the version of the model we're going to talk about, is really going to be focused on this multiple life stages question. The idea that cognitive and non-cognitive skills are different and related to each other is a really important part of his body of work, but it's too mathematically complicated for us to play with. So in the next video, I'm going to lay out those models and talk through why they work, and then we're going to solve them and look at some implications.